They found a telegram from 1953 that the studio legal team tried to shred. It said, "Peck is gone. He's heading north. If the trade's here, he's at a nobody's funeral. We can't protect his image." The truth is, Gregory Peck was pulling the pin on a grenade and holding it right next to his career. I've seen the internal studio memos they tried to bury for decades. One read, "Gregory is off the grid. He's jeopardizing a multi-million-dollar production for a ghost." This wasn't just a nice guy moment. It was a calculated act of professional suicide. Hollywood's most polished icon was breaking the most sacred rule of the Golden Age. Never, ever humanize the legend. You see, most stars were untouchable gods. They lived behind high gates and ironclad PR teams. But Peck decided to burn that script and drive 4 hours into a total eclipse of his own reputation. Think about the timing. He was at the absolute peak of his power. One wrong move, and the studios would replace him with the next handsome face in a heartbeat. If you've ever felt like you're the only one doing the right thing while everyone else calls you crazy, if you saw a reflection of yourself in this story, you belong here. Subscribe. Now, look at the first piece of this puzzle. It starts with a woman named Casey. She wasn't a starlet. She wasn't a producer. She was a fan who had written hundreds of letters that mostly went into a trash bin at the studio. But one letter actually made it to Peck's desk. It didn't ask for money or a signed photo. It was a goodbye. While his agents were screaming about contracts in Los Angeles, Peck was staring at a piece of stationery in a quiet trailer. The studio heads were livid. They had millions on the line and their lead actor was MIA. They sent scouts. They called every hotel. Nothing. Then we have the second piece. A dusty road in the California heat. A black sedan is speeding away from the glitz of the city. No driver, no bodyguard, just a man and a map. This wasn't a PR stunt. It was a secret. If the paparazzi had caught him, they would have painted him as a mental case. Why would a man who earns more in a week than most families do in a decade drive 4 hours for a funeral? The industry elites thought he had lost his mind, but the reality of the backstage drama was far more intense. They tried to block his car. They threatened legal action. Peck didn't care. He was chasing something that wasn't in any script. Then there's the third piece. A small wooden church in a town that doesn't appear on most maps. The air is thick with the smell of old hymnals and floor wax. There are only 6 people in the pews. They are waiting for a service to start for a woman who lived a quiet, invisible life. Then, the heavy door creaks open. A man in a sharp suit walks in. He isn't Atticus Finch. He isn't a movie star. He's a driver who just finished a 4-hour trek through the dirt to honor a promise no one else knew he made. The studio's threats were ringing in his ears, but the silence of that church was louder. This was the moment the legend died and the man took over. Again, the scouts were closing in, and the career he spent 20 years building was hanging by a single, dusty thread. Think about the timing. The studio wasn't just annoyed. They were terrified. Gregory Peck wasn't just an actor. He was a multi-million-dollar asset belonging to a corporate machine that didn't have a heartbeat. While he was sitting in that dusty church, the suits back in Hollywood were losing their minds. Picture the scene. Phones are being slammed onto desks. Cigarette smoke is thick enough to choke a horse. Lawyers are frantically flipping through contracts, looking for a clause that would let them sue Peck into bankruptcy. They didn't see a man honoring a fan. They saw a glitch in the system. They saw a paycheck walking away. You there, sitting at home, you might think fame is all about the red carpets and the champagne. The truth is much uglier. It's a golden cage, and Peck had just picked the lock. Let's look at the second piece of this puzzle. Think about Casey's room. It wasn't a palace. It was a tiny apartment with cracked wallpaper and a radiator that hissed all night. This woman spent her life savings on stamps and stationery. She wasn't a stalker. She was someone who found a sense of dignity in Peck's screen presence. Every letter she wrote was a physical act of hope. She used a fountain pen that leaked ink onto her fingers. She sat at a wooden desk that wobbled every time she leaned on it. While the world ignored her, she was building a bridge to a man she'd never meet. And the irony, the studio heads, the people who claimed to know the audience, didn't even know she existed. They saw the masses. Peck saw the person. The scouts the studio sent out weren't just looking for an actor. They were hunting a fugitive. They were driving up and down those back roads in black cars, looking for a silver lining in a PR nightmare. They finally saw his car parked outside that church. They didn't see a hero. They saw a liability. Now look at the third piece, the interaction inside that church. The 6 people in the pews were mostly elderly. They didn't watch the evening news. They didn't care about box office returns. To them, the man who walked in was just a stranger showing respect. But then, the scouts burst in. Imagine the sound of heavy leather shoes echoing on the floorboards during a prayer. It was a theater of the absurd. 2 guys in cheap suits, sweating through their shirts, trying to intimidate a man who had played the most iconic lawyer in cinema history. One of them actually reached out to grab Peck's shoulder. Think about the audacity. You are standing in a place of mourning, and you're worried about a shooting schedule. Peck didn't flinch. He didn't cause a scene. He simply turned his head, looked the man in the eyes, and the scout froze. It wasn't a movie line. It was real-world gravity. The scout stepped back because, in that moment, the celebrity facade was gone. What was left was a man who was willing to let his career die to finish a funeral service. The air in that room stayed heavy. You could hear a fly buzzing against the stained glass. The preacher continued, as if the Hollywood circus wasn't standing in the back of the room. Peck stayed until the very last word. He didn't rush. He didn't look at his watch. He stood up, walked to the front, and placed a single hand on the casket. No cameras were allowed. No press release was drafted. This was a private contract between a star and the person who made him one. Outside, the scouts were on their radios, reporting back to the studio. "We found him. He's coming back." But they were wrong. The man who got back into that car wasn't the same guy who left the set. He had seen the reality of what his work meant to a single, lonely soul. The studio tried to spin it later. They tried to say it was a medical emergency or a misunderstanding. That's the classic industry lie. They wanted to hide the fact that their biggest star had a moral compass they couldn't control. Think about the money again. Peck knew that every minute he stayed in that town, he was burning bridges. Directors were furious. Co-stars were complaining about their own schedules. The industry is a house of cards, and Peck was pulling out the bottom row. But here is the secret the history books won't tell you. When he finally got back to the set, the atmosphere changed. The crew didn't look at him with anger. They looked at him with awe. They realized they weren't working for a puppet. They were working for a man who actually stood for something. The studio wanted to fine him. They wanted to punish him. But they couldn't. How do you punish a man who has already shown he doesn't care about your money? You can't. He had broken the spell. Now consider the aftermath. Casey's family, the few who were there, didn't go to the papers. They didn't sell the story to a tabloid for a quick buck. They kept the secret for years. It only leaked out much later through a retired studio hand who had seen the frantic telegrams. This wasn't a PR stunt because there was no PR. If Peck had wanted credit, he would have brought a photographer. He didn't. He brought a map and a sense of duty. Compare that to the stars you see today. They can't even buy a coffee without a camera crew following them to leak their charity work. Peck's move was a direct middle finger to the entire system of manufactured fame. It was raw, it was real, and it almost cost him everything. Look at the footage of him from that era. You can see a different look in his eyes, a certain steeliness. He knew the studio was watching him like a hawk from that day on. They tried to micromanage his every move. They tried to put morality clauses in his scripts, but the damage to their control was done. He had proven that a fan's life was worth more than a day's production budget. You sitting there, watching this, you have to ask yourself, who are the people you admire? Are they the ones who show up when the cameras are rolling, or the ones who drive 4 hours into the desert when the world is telling them to stay put? Peck chose the desert. He chose the dusty church. He chose the woman who had nothing to give him but a thank you note. That is the reality of the backstage drama that Hollywood tried to bury. They wanted a star, but they accidentally hired a human being. And in that town, in that industry, being a human being is the most dangerous career move you can ever make. The scouts eventually followed him all the way back to the city limits. They were like vultures circling a car. But Peck didn't even look in the rearview mirror. He was done playing their game. When he walked back onto that soundstage, the director tried to scream. The producers tried to demand an explanation. Peck just walked to his chair, sat down, and asked for his lines. No apology, no excuses. He had honored his promise, and now he was back to do his job. The studio realized they were powerless. They needed him more than he needed them. That is the ultimate leverage. Not money, not fame, but the willingness to walk away from all of it for something that actually matters. Subscribe for more deep dives into the side of Hollywood they don't want you to see. Turn on notifications so you never miss the truth behind the glamour. The legend of the man didn't grow because of the movies he made. It grew because of the funeral he attended when everyone told him to stay in his trailer. He didn't just play Atticus Finch. For one day in a dusty California town, he actually was him. And that scared the hell out of the people in charge. The executives didn't just forget about that trip to the desert. They kept a black file on him for years. Every time Peck negotiated a new contract, the lawyers would bring up that unauthorized absence. They tried to frame it as a mental breakdown or a lapse in professional judgment. But the truth is, it was the moment the studio lost the war. They realized they were dealing with a man who prioritized a dusty funeral over $1 million production schedule. That is a nightmare for a producer. They want puppets, not people with a pulse. The set of To Kill a Mockingbird went cold after that. The air was thick with resentment from the suits in the trailers, while the crew looked at Peck like a hero. He didn't care about the tension. He just did the work and went home. The film eventually hit theaters and became one of the greatest stories ever told. But the real story was what happened when the cameras were off. Most people are content to let the Hollywood PR machine rot their brains with fake stories about celebrity kindness that never actually happened. If you want to finally unbrainwash yourself and see how the industry really works behind the scenes, you need to subscribe to this channel as an investment in for what he did. But as soon as the movie started winning awards, they changed their tune. They started using his integrity as a marketing tool to sell more tickets. It is a theater of the absurd, where the very people who tried to destroy him for being human ended up profiting the most from his reputation. They didn't respect his choice. They just realized they could package it and sell it back to the public for a premium. Peck got the last laugh, but Hollywood got the check. That's the only way the story ever really ends in that town. The lights in the ballroom were blinding as Gregory Peck walked up to the podium to accept his Best Actor Oscar for To Kill a Mockingbird. You could see the sweat on the brows of the studio heads in the front row. They were not sweating because of the heat. They were sweating because their supposed problem child was now the most powerful man in the room. They had spent months calling his desert trip a career-ending move in their private memos. They had page after page detailing how he was unstable for putting a real person's funeral over a fake movie's production schedule. But now, those same memos were being shredded as fast as the machines could handle. The suits did not apologize. Instead, they did something much more calculated and disgusting. They turned his defiance into